My name is Marissa, and the night my world shattered began not with a scream, but with the sharp crack of Victor's fist slamming into my stomach. The impact stole the air from my lungs and left a metallic taste of blood rising in my throat, as if my body itself was protesting the betrayal. Pain shot through me white hot, twisting my insides until I dropped to my knees, clutching what I thought was still safe within me. His face was steady, unreadable, almost like a doctor running a test, and he whispered that word proof as though destroying me was a form of science. Before I could even gasp for breath, a sound cut through the silence, sharper than the blow itself. Selena, my sister, leaned casually against the railing, her eyes gleaming as though she had been waiting for this exact moment, and she laughed. Not nervous, not kind, but cruel laughter that bounced off the walls, echoing in my ears long after my body hit the floor. It was the kind of laugh that told me I was alone, surrounded by people who chose entertainment over blood. In that instant, betrayal had two faces, Victor with his cold fist, and Selena with her wicked smile, and together they crushed me into a silence so heavy it almost buried me. But what none of them knew was that even as I lay there gasping in the dark, a seed of something colder was already forming inside me, the beginning of proof of my own, the kind that would one day burn their entire world down. I used to believe marriage meant safety, but looking back now, I see that belief was the first illusion Victor stole from me. When I met him at 23, he was charming, the kind of man who lit up a room with quiet confidence and who looked at me like I was the only person who mattered. I mistook that attention for love, and when he proposed after just 1 year, I said yes, without hesitation, thinking I had won a future filled with stability and laughter. For a while it seemed true, but slowly his warmth cooled, his affection shrank into polite gestures, and his words shifted from encouragement to judgment. Still, I clung to him, believing that if I was patient, if I gave more, if I became the wife he expected, he would return to the man I fell for. Then came the pregnancy tests, months of hope turning into disappointment, each single line cutting me open in private, while Victor offered only a dismissive shrug. Once when I cried in the bathroom wrapped in a towel to hide my shaking, he knocked on the door, not to comfort me but to say, "Keep it down, the neighbors might hear." That was the night I learned how silence can be more violent than shouting. The doctors told me after surgery that carrying a child might be difficult, but not impossible. And in those words, I planted a stubborn seed of hope. For 3 long years, I charted cycles, swallowed vitamins, endured needles and procedures while Victor grew colder. He said maybe it's better this way, maybe we're not meant to be parents, as if that verdict was his alone to declare. Yet inside me, the dream never died, and when the faint second line appeared on the test a year later, I could barely breathe. My hands trembled not with fear, but with a fragile joy I had not allowed myself to feel in years. I sat on the edge of the bathtub in our Chapel Hill home, the sunlight crawling across the tiles while I stared at those 2 lines as though they were sacred. I didn't scream. I didn't run to Victor. I didn't even smile. I just sat there letting the weight of possibility sink into me like warm water. This time I told myself I would protect it. I would wait for the doctor to confirm. I would hold it close until I was ready. Deep down, though, the truth was uglier. I didn't trust him, not with my heart, not with this fragile life. I remembered too clearly the way he looked at me after the first miscarriage, like I had embarrassed him, like grief itself was shameful. He had said, "Let's not tell anyone, it's humiliating enough." And the words etched themselves into me so deeply that I swore if I was ever blessed again, I would not let him steal the joy from it. That night when he came home early, tossing his keys into the dish and asking flatly what was for dinner, I wanted to tell him, but the words stuck in my throat. He didn't smile, he didn't kiss me, he barely looked at me as he ate the leftover chili and walked upstairs before I had even finished my plate. I sat at the table staring at the space he left behind. One hand pressed over my stomach, whispering a promise into the silence. "You are real, I believe in you, even if he never will." It was a vow I had no idea would cost me everything, but it was also the first flicker of defiance, the quiet beginning of a war I never asked for, but one I would eventually finish. The following morning, I tried to convince myself that the heaviness in Victor's eyes was nothing more than fatigue, but as I moved through the motions of cleaning, folding laundry, stacking dishes, I felt a gnawing sense of being watched. It was not paranoia, not imagination, but something sharper, an instinct that prickled my skin every time his gaze lingered too long or his footsteps stopped outside the room I was in. When I reached into my purse to pull out a grocery list, my fingers brushed against something foreign, cold, smooth out of place. I dug deeper and pulled out a tiny black recorder no bigger than a thumb drive, and my heart plummeted into my stomach. For a long minute I couldn't breathe, staring at the object as though it might bite me back. Had Victor put this there, or had someone else slipped it into my bag during a visit? My mind raced through memories of leaving the purse unattended, flashes of Selena dropping by under the guise of checking on me, her hands too curious, her eyes too calculating. I shoved the device back into the purse, my chest tightening because confronting him now felt dangerous. Better to wait, better to collect more than my own trembling suspicion. That evening, Victor suddenly shifted his demeanor sitting at the breakfast bar the next morning and casually asking, "Didn't you have that OB checkup coming up?" The words froze me in place because I had never told him about it, and I never marked medical appointments on the family calendar. When I stammered something about sleep, he only raised an eyebrow and watched me sip my decaf coffee like a scientist observing a lab rat. It was not care, it was an experiment. Lying beside him in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt the memory of the first miscarriage claw its way back. How he had patted my back like I was a child and told me the next morning not to speak of it because it was embarrassing. The same man was now watching me cataloging every symptom, every refusal of wine, every yawn. On Saturday morning, Selena called her voice sugar-sweet over the line as she teased me for sounding heavier and laughed as if she knew more than she should. She pressed me to attend the family dinner, insisting that everyone had been asking about me, especially Victor. When we hung up, my hand stayed tight around the phone, pulse racing in my throat because her tone was too playful, too pointed. Later that day, I walked into my office and noticed the journal on my desk was not where I left it, pages bent open with a ribbon I never used. Inside, I saw the raw entry I had written after losing the first baby, my handwriting smeared as if a thumb had pressed too hard over my words. And suddenly, I remembered Selena's joke at brunch weeks later when she laughed about me resetting the clock. She had read this, she had weaponized my grief. I closed the journal with shaking hands, whispering into the empty room, "So that's how you knew." That night, Victor went to bed claiming a migraine, and I curled up on the couch in the living room, one hand instinctively protecting my stomach. From the hallway, I caught the faintest shadow of him standing there, watching, silent, unreadable. And it was in that stillness I realized I was not simply married to a man who doubted me, but trapped with someone who was studying me, waiting for proof to justify a cruelty he had already decided to deliver. The walls of that house no longer felt like protection, but like witnesses to a crime not yet committed, and every breath I took felt like evidence being recorded against me. By the time Friday arrived, I told myself I was too tired to go to the family gathering, but Victor insisted, saying it would look suspicious if we skipped again, and his insistence felt less like an invitation and more like a command. I wore a long cardigan over a blouse loose enough to disguise the subtle changes in my body and sat quietly in the passenger seat as we drove in silence to his parents' new house. The backyard glowed with twinkle lights and chatter drifted through the air. Cousins laughing uncles playing cornhole, the smell of grilled meat and Chardonnay mixing into a scene that should have been warm, but for me carried the weight of a stage set for humiliation. I kept to the corner sipping sparkling water, pretending it was wine, while Victor moved smoothly among relatives, shaking hands wearing his polished host smile that never reached me. Then Selena arrived late, as always, striding through the crowd in a gleaming white jumpsuit, her eyes finding me instantly as if I were her private audience. She hugged me a little too tightly, whispering in my ear, "You're glowing, must be something in your belly," before handing me a small pink gift bag with glitter letters. For future little surprises, she said loud enough for nearby cousins to laugh. My stomach turned and I wanted to disappear, but the night pressed on people asking about vacations and home renovations, until I felt like a ghost clinging to the edges of their conversations. Each time I declined wine, I caught Victor's mother tilting her head and his father narrowing his eyes, and then Victor himself chimed in with a forced chuckle saying, "She's been eating strange lately, cravings or something." The room's attention shifted toward me, calculating eyes sweeping over my body as though they had the right to dissect me. I reached for my purse, desperate to find the comfort of my phone, only to see it slip from the table and tumble onto the deck with a hollow thud. When I bent down to grab it, a collective gasp cut through the music because there in the open pocket lay the pregnancy test faint lines, still visible, the same one I had hidden away like a sacred secret. Selena clasped a hand to her chest, gasping with dramatic flair. "Are you seriously carrying that thing around like a trophy?" Someone snorted and Aunt whispered, and laughter rippled soft, cruel daggers in the air. Victor picked up the test, turned it slowly in his hand. His expression cold, his voice sharper than ice as he announced, "This isn't new. She's been keeping it for weeks. Don't read too much into it." Every pair of eyes turned toward me, heat crawling up my neck, shame pounding in my chest, while Selena leaned back against the patio door, smiling with quiet triumph. I stumbled to the bathroom, shut the door against their whispers, and stared at the harsh reflection in the mirror. A stranger's face, pale, hollow eyes wide with humiliation. My palm rested over my stomach, a silent apology to the life within me, as if I could shield it from their mockery. Tears wouldn't come, only a hollow ache and a sharp realization that my family was not family at all, but a circle of spectators entertained by my pain. When I finally opened the bathroom door, Selena was waiting, arms crossed, her lips curled in a half smile. "Was that supposed to be your big reveal?" she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. I said nothing, but inside, something fractured into something colder, sharper, the first ember of defiance flickering deep beneath the crushing weight of their betrayal. The drive home after the party was suffocating, Victor's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while I sat rigid, staring out the window, forcing each breath to stay steady. Not a word was spoken, the silence between us, thick with something heavier than anger. It was calculation. When we pulled into the driveway, he didn't wait for me to step out. Instead, he strode ahead into the house, his footsteps echoing like a summons. I followed reluctantly, my body still trembling from the humiliation, but before I could retreat upstairs, he turned on the landing, his eyes dark, sharp, and empty. "Enough games," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You're not pregnant, you just want attention." I froze my hand instinctively, hovering over my stomach as though I could shield it from his words. "I am pregnant, Victor," I whispered, but my voice shook. His mouth twisted in something that might have been a smile in another context, but now looked more like a predator baring its teeth. "Some women fake it," he muttered, and then his eyes locked on mine with a chilling calm. "Maybe a punch will show the truth." The words didn't have time to settle before his fist drove into my abdomen, a blow so sudden and brutal that the breath was ripped out of me and the world tilted sideways. I collapsed onto the stairs, the carpet scraping my knees, the shock radiating from my core in waves of agony so sharp it stole sound itself. For a moment, there was nothing but ringing in my ears and the taste of iron rising in my throat. I gasped, clutching my stomach, terror slicing through me sharper than the pain, but above me came the sound that cut deeper than any fist. Selena's laughter light, almost musical, floating down the hallway as she leaned casually against the railing, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She didn't ask if I was okay, she didn't move to help. She simply laughed like she was watching a performance written for her pleasure. That laughter hollowed me out more than the blow itself because it told me the truth. I had been denying all along my sister wasn't a bystander. She was an accomplice, and my pain was her entertainment. I lay curled on the floor, every muscle screaming, every breath shallow, as Victor crouched beside me, suddenly donning the mask of concern. "You tripped," he said loudly enough for any listening ears. She lost her balance. His tone smooth controlled the practiced voice of a man who knew how to twist reality to his will. My throat burned with words I couldn't force out, and in that silence I realized how dangerous he truly was. Minutes later, he guided me to the car, his arm firm around me, not in comfort, but in control, driving me to the hospital in silence, both hands on the wheel, too steady to be genuine. No music, no questions, only the measured sound of his breathing, as though he were rehearsing for an alibi. Under the fluorescent hospital lights, I drifted between numbness and the searing ache that told me something had been torn from me. Nurses moved swiftly, their voices hushed, their eyes avoiding mine, as though they already knew what the tests would reveal. Victor sat in the corner, flipping through a magazine like we were waiting for a haircut, not the fate of our child. Eventually, a doctor entered, her face grave, her words soft. "You were pregnant," she said, but the pregnancy did not survive the trauma. The world didn't spin, it simply stopped, and I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles while silence roared louder than any scream. I placed a trembling hand over my stomach, whispering a goodbye. I had whispered once before, but this time I knew it wasn't chance. It wasn't my body betraying me. It was him, and it was her. And though the grief threatened to drown me, something else began to stir in that moment. Something colder than grief, sharper than despair, a seed of rage and resolve that even in that sterile room could not be silenced. The hours after the doctor's words blurred into a haze of monitors beeping and footsteps echoing down sterile halls, but no sound could drown out the hollow ache inside me. I stared at the ceiling tiles, their gray patterns swimming like cracks in a dam, barely holding back the flood of grief pressing against my chest. A nurse adjusted the IV, her hands gentle, her eyes lingering on me with unspoken understanding before she whispered softly, "You didn't just fall, did you?" My mouth opened, but no words came, and she nodded as if my silence was answer enough before slipping away. Victor sat in the corner, his legs crossed, magazine in hand, flipping pages with a calm that felt staged too casual for a man who had just learned his wife had lost a child. Every sigh, every glance at the clock was a reminder that my suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. Hours later, when I was moved to a recovery room, he scrolled on his phone while I lay still, my hand over my abdomen, whispering apologies to a life that never had a chance to be. The memories of the night replayed on loop, his fist, the sound of Selena's laughter, the way the house seemed to hold its breath as if complicit in the violence. Grief clawed at me, but beneath it something sharper took root, the knowledge that this loss was not an accident but a choice, made by two people who should have protected me and instead destroyed me. When Victor finally looked up, he only said, "We'll move past this as though it were a stain on a shirt that could be scrubbed away." I turned my head toward the window, unable to meet his eyes, because if I did, I might have screamed loud enough for the whole hospital to hear. Instead, I saved my voice for something else because even in my devastation, I understood that silence was a weapon too, and if he wanted me to stay small and broken, I would not give him that satisfaction. Selena's message arrived on my phone, a single emoji, a yellow smiling face glowing on the dark screen like a signature of her cruelty. I stared at it until my hands shook, not from weakness, but from rage, because even in my bed, hollowed out by loss, she wanted to remind me that my pain was her entertainment. That was when I knew this story was no longer just about survival. It was about evidence proof, not of pregnancy, but of betrayal calculated and deliberate. As dawn seeped through the blinds, casting pale light across the sheets, I made a vow as binding as any I had ever spoken aloud. They thought they had buried me under silence, but what they had really done was hand me the beginning of their undoing. When I was discharged the following day, Victor offered to drive, but I refused and ordered a car on my phone, my voice flat, steady enough to make him blink in surprise. I slid into the back seat, clutching my bag like armor, and stared out the window as the city blurred past, knowing every mile was a step away from silence and a step closer to truth. Once home, I locked myself in the office, the smallest room in the house. Once painted yellow for a nursery that never came to be, now covered in dull taupe walls that carried ghosts of what should have been. I pulled open drawers and found the leather journal bent at the edges, pages warped from tears I had spilled months ago. Only now I noticed the smudges, the pressed indentations, as if someone had thumbed through my grief with curiosity. Selena! I remembered her mocking brunch comment, the cruel accuracy of her jokes, and realized she had read my most private words and sharpened them into knives to use against me. Fury steadied my hands as I dug deeper, uncovering a receipt shoved between old bills. Victor's name printed on top, dated months earlier from a medical novelty site, the item code leading to fake ultrasound kits. He had planted the idea long before last night, seeding doubt, preparing his narrative like a lawyer rehearsing for trial. My stomach turned, but my resolve crystallized. I snapped pictures of the receipt, saved them to a hidden cloud folder one he could never access, and labeled it, in case they come for me again. Then I reached for my phone, scrolled through old recordings, and there it was, an audio file dated from a doctor's visit last month. Victor's voice calm, cold, asking, "How can one really verify if a pregnancy is real? Some women exaggerate, for attention." The chill that ran through me wasn't surprise. It was confirmation, the proof of intent, the map of his gaslighting. I listened twice, then 3 times, letting his detachment etch itself into my memory. And every repetition fed the fire inside me until grief hardened into something unbreakable. I turned to the security system Victor claimed he installed for our safety and used the forgotten pamphlet he left in a drawer to call support. Within minutes, I had access to the archive footage, scrolling until I reached the night of the party, my heart pounding louder with every click. I saw the backyard alive with chatter and lights. Selena's dramatic entrance, the cousins laughing. Then at 7:03, the moment my purse fell, the pregnancy test tumbling out. At 7:04, the screen went black. Not a glitch, but 2 solid hours of erased footage, and when it returned, the chaos was already over. I sat back, staring at the blank stretch of recording, knowing it was not coincidence, it was control. I exported the file gap and all to a flash drive, encrypted it, then deleted the original from the system, slipping the small silver stick into my palm like a weapon. Proof layered upon proof. Journal receipt, audio, video. Each piece a shard of glass they thought I would never dare to hold, but together they formed a blade sharp enough to cut through every lie. In the stillness of that office, I whispered to myself, if they think I am bluffing, they are going to regret it, and for the first time since the blow, I felt air fill my lungs, not as a victim, but as someone preparing for war. The invitation came 2 days later, a polite message from Victor's mother asking me to join the family for dinner, a calm discussion to clear the air, her words dripping with the same rehearsed gentility that had always masked their cruelty. I charged my phone, slipped the flash drive into the lining of my purse, and pressed the record button on a small device I carried now like a lifeline. When I arrived, the dining room glowed with candlelight, the table set for 10, but only 8 filled Selena, making her usual dramatic late entrance in silk that shimmered under the chandelier. Victor greeted me at the door, touching my back as if we were still married, as if he had not shattered everything inside me. I took my seat and let them play their parts, his father asking about my work, his mother passing bread with a smile that never touched her eyes, suggesting therapy because trauma makes us misinterpret things. I listened silently, tasting the bitterness of their script until Selena finally slid into her chair, raising her glass at me as though I were the guest of honor at my own destruction. That was the moment I pulled the flash drive from my purse and placed it in the center of the table, the small silver body gleaming under the lights. "What's that?" Victor asked, his voice tight. Proof, I answered, simply my gaze fixed on him. Proof of what his father demanded. And so, I began calmly, deliberately revealing one piece at a time. The email Victor had sent his lawyer weeks before. I told anyone about the pregnancy, already asking how to handle a divorce if it was deemed fake. The receipt for the fake ultrasound kit purchased months earlier. The audio file of his voice captured in the doctor's office asking how to verify if a pregnancy was real. And finally, the video file showing the 2-hour blackout, the deliberate erasure of the party's most damning moment. Their faces shifted from skepticism to silence, the weight of evidence pressing down heavier than any accusation. I was not begging. I was not pleading. I was building a wall of truth, brick by brick, until there was no air left for their lies. Victor's father's jaw tightened, his mother's glass clinked against the table. Selena's smirk faltered for the first time. Then I pressed play on my phone, and the dining room filled with Victor's voice. If she keeps lying, maybe a fall will make her tell the truth. Forks dropped, a gasp escaped someone's lips. Selena whispered, "I told you not to leave proof." Her words slicing through the quiet like a confession. Victor stood, his face pale, his hands clenched, insisting, "This is ridiculous. You're twisting everything," but I was already on my feet. "I'm not here for your forgiveness," I said, my voice calm. I'm here because you don't get to rewrite my pain. I left the flash drive on the table like a live grenade turned and walked toward the door, their voices rising behind me, his father shouting, Selena snapping, Victor protesting, but I did not look back. The night air outside was warm, the silence almost tender compared to the storm inside, but in my pocket the recorder blinked red, every word preserved, every gasp captured. For the first time I felt not powerless but prepared. They had wanted a stage, and I had given them one, only this time the script was mine. The morning after the dinner, I sat across from my lawyer in a cramped office downtown, sliding the flash drive across the table with hands that no longer trembled. He listened as I laid out the timeline receipts, recordings, journal entries, every piece fitting together into a picture too sharp to deny. By the time I finished, he leaned back, eyes steady, and said, "This is not just a domestic dispute. This is a case of calculated abuse and conspiracy." His words settled over me like a shield, heavier than hope, but stronger than fear. Within days, the anonymous essay I posted under the title Gaslit by Blood began spreading across advocacy forums picked up by journalists and reshared by strangers who recognized themselves in my story. 30,000 views turned into 60, then into headlines. Local woman challenges family abuse, family trauma exposed with receipts. My phone buzzed with messages from women I had never met thanking me for speaking when they could not, and their voices built a chorus louder than Selena's laugh ever could. Victor tried to fight back, filing a statement that I had exaggerated, that I was unstable, but the evidence spoke louder than his polished denials. The audio of him questioning my pregnancy at the doctor's office, the receipt of the fake ultrasound kit, the blackout in the security footage. Each piece dismantled his facade until his lawyer began to falter. Selena attempted her own defense, posting a tearful video about forgiveness and family being messy. But the comments turned against her, calling her performance transparent, mocking her crocodile tears. Sponsors dropped her blog partnerships, dried up, and the title Toxic Sister followed her across every platform. Victor's employer quietly placed him on leave, then terminated him when the story hit national coverage, citing conduct unbecoming. The man who once lorded over me with calm authority now found himself whispered about in lobbies and blasted across headlines. His parents retreated into silence, their once curated image of a perfect family crumbling under the weight of exposure. Meanwhile, a neighbor, Ivy, stepped forward, submitting a signed statement that she had witnessed Victor strike me that night, saw him wait until my back was turned, and then drive his fist into my stomach. Her words sealed the case, turning what they had dismissed as my drama into undeniable testimony. My lawyer looked at me across the conference table and said, "They wanted you to be quiet, but you gave them the one thing they never expected: a paper trail." Court filings became public record, and suddenly the narrative was no longer theirs to twist. I walked into the courthouse one morning not as a wife begging for recognition, but as a plaintiff carrying the truth. Victor avoided my eyes. Selena kept her head down, and the judge did not hesitate. Protective orders were granted, charges filed, reputations dismantled in the space of an hour. The justice I had whispered to myself in the dark was no longer a dream, it was unfolding in real time. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but I said nothing. I did not need to, because every shred of evidence had already spoken for me. The consequences were not abstract, they were visible and permanent. Victor stripped of his career. Selena branded for what she was, their parents left to answer questions they could not spin. And through it all, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, but clarity. The understanding that survival had never been weakness, it had been strategy. They had tried to bury me in silence, and I had answered with proof, and now the silence belonged to them. When the dust began to settle, I found myself sitting alone at the dining table, the same place where I had once sat staring at an empty chair across from me while Victor chewed in silence. But this time, the weight pressing on my chest was different. It was not fear, not humiliation. It was a strange lightness, like breathing through a cracked window after years of stale air. The messages kept pouring in from strangers who saw their own pain mirrored in mine. And every thank you, every "you made me feel less alone," stitched something small but vital back together inside me. Yet healing was not about the applause. It was about reclaiming what had been taken and learning to stand inside my own skin without apology. One afternoon, I drove to the lake just outside Chapel Hill, a place Victor and I once visited, dreaming of picnics and toddlers that never came to be, and I carried with me a small stone engraved with the word "still." I knelt at the edge of the water, placed it gently in the dirt where the grass met the shore, and whispered goodbye, not just to the child I lost, but to the years I spent burying myself under their control. I did not cry because the tears had already been shed. I simply let the silence speak for me, and in that silence, I felt something close, a door softly shutting on a chapter that no longer owned me. Days later, I attended a retreat organized by the Women's Advocacy Collective, where survivors of abuse shared stories in whispers and in roars, and when they called my name, I walked to the microphone, my legs steady, my hands no longer shaking. I am not here to tell you how to heal. I began, my voice catching only once. I am here to tell you that you are not crazy and you are not alone. Faces nodded, eyes filled with tears, and in that moment, I understood that my story was no longer just mine. It was a torch passed from one hand to another, lighting paths through the same darkness. Later that night back home, I opened my blog, not the anonymous one that had launched a storm, but the one with my name and my face, and I wrote the words they never wanted me to say aloud. They called it a lie. I called it survival. I hit publish and felt no fear because the truth was no longer something I had to hide. It was something I had earned the right to own. Victor had lost his career, Selena, her reputation, their family, the facade they built. But I had gained something they could never touch, the freedom to speak without trembling. Healing was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was quiet, consistent. The steady reclaiming of my life, one room, one memory, one word at a time. And as I wrote my final lines, I left space for the people listening on the other side of the screen. Have you ever been silenced just to keep the peace, only to lose yourself in the process? If you have, tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what part of this story reached you because your voice matters. If this story touched you, type 1 in the comments so I know you are out there, and do not forget to subscribe because the only way to break silence is to keep telling stories that hurt and heal and remind us that none of us are alone. That is how justice lives, not just in courtrooms, but in every voice brave enough to say this happened to me, and I will not be quiet anymore. The final step came in a courthouse hallway, painted in dull beige, echoing with footsteps that did not belong to me as I clutched the envelope containing the signed divorce agreement. Victor arrived 2 minutes before the hearing. His blazer pressed his expression carefully neutral, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. His lawyer nodded stiffly at mine. The judge asked if we had statements to make, and I shook my head because the evidence had already spoken louder than I ever could. My name flowed onto the paper, followed by a period final and unshaken. When it was over, I stepped outside into the sunlight, and for the first time in years, the air did not taste like confinement. It tasted like freedom. Victor lost his job, and his reputation collapsed into whispers that trailed him wherever he went. Selena's carefully crafted online persona disintegrated under the weight of exposure. Sponsors abandoned her, and every time she posted a new attempt at reinvention, the comments dragged her back to the truth she could never erase. Their parents retreated into silence, their social circles shrinking under the glare of scandal, and I realized then that consequences were not always swift, but they were inevitable. At home, I opened my laptop, scrolling through folders until I found one labeled Letters Never Sent. Inside was a draft to Selena written months earlier, begging for an explanation, asking why she hated me enough to turn my grief into entertainment. I read every line with detached clarity, then deleted it without hesitation because I no longer needed answers from someone who had already chosen cruelty. I moved on to the photographs, deleting image after image of Victor and me at galas and family dinners, each picture once staged to look perfect, now nothing more than artifacts of manipulation. It was not about forgetting, it was about refusing to honor lies with space in my life. That evening I sat on the couch, the windows open to let in the summer night air, and for once the silence was not heavy, it was gentle. I thought about the women who had written to me, the survivors who had whispered thank you into the digital void, and I understood that my story was no longer a wound. It was a weapon against the silence that had nearly buried me. Healing did not mean pretending nothing happened. It meant carrying the truth like a banner that said, "I survived and I fought back." When the doorbell rang, I found an unmarked envelope on the mat inside a letter from the Women's Advocacy Collective inviting me to speak at another gathering of survivors. They told me my voice could help others find theirs, and though I did not yet feel ready, I knew readiness was not the point, honesty was. A few days later, I stood before a small crowd of women, young and old, each of us carrying scars visible or invisible. And when I spoke, I told them the one thing I had learned in the ashes of my pain. Silence is not surrender. It is the space where truth gathers strength until it can no longer be denied. They called it a lie. I called it survival, and now I call it freedom.